Hello, my name is Jackie Farn. I've been an entertainer all my life, professionally known as Valentino, and I've been lucky enough to work all over the world, from the London Palladium to the Hollywood Bowl, with some of the greatest talents in show business, including Tom Jones, Shirley Bassey, Frank Sinatra and the Beatles. So you can imagine I've got lots and lots of great stories to tell. But the story I'm about to relate to you now isn't about show business. It's a very troubling story of lies, deceit and treachery on a very grand scale. It all began in 1970 when my wife and I purchased the old village school and schoolhouse in the village of White Roding, deep in the heart of the Essex countryside in the United Kingdom. We spent 7 years converting it into what eventually became a wonderful home for us both. It was a huge project which wasn't made any easier by the objections from some of the residents in the village, and especially from White Roding Parish Council. Over the years they objected to everything we did. They were always having a pop at us, but we just ignored them. Parish councils are made up of very dull and very sad people who lead such boring lives that they've got nothing better to do than stick their noses into other people's business. They're not interested in the local community or conservation or green belt. That's all a front. All they're interested in is having a little bit of power, trying to be important and trying to stop others doing something that they either haven't the money, the talent or the guts to do. They're quite pathetic, really. In 1999 I developed a detached retina in my left eye. Unfortunately, it was misdiagnosed, not by one, but by 2 doctors. I underwent a major operation to try and save the sight in the eye, but I was left with double vision. I later developed a detached retina in my right eye. Now I couldn't see my keyboards, let alone play them. And what little eyesight I had was very, very distorted. And to date, I've had 18 different procedures and operations on my eyes. This obviously had a huge impact not only on my career, but on my whole life. Not only could I not perform on stage anymore, but I couldn't drive or do any of the normal day-to-day things that I used to do. But I was determined to return to the stage, even though I knew it was going to be a very, very long journey. I had to literally start learning to play the piano and the accordion all over again. But I reckon that if Stevie Wonder could do it, then surely I could as well. My medical team advised that I needed to live in a smaller environment. I didn't want to move from the White Roding where I'd lived for 40 years, but there was a small thatched cottage in the grounds of my home, which I'd used occasionally for guests, for overnight accommodation, which I thought might be ideal for development, if I could get planning permission to make it larger. So I contacted my local council representative, Councillor Susan Barker. She was a councillor not only for Uttlesford District Council, but also for Essex County Council as well. I went to meet her at her house at Little Garnet's, Bishop's Green in Barston, Great Dunmow, and I explained my situation to her. When she heard my story, to my surprise, she suggested I demolish my house. She said, "You can knock it down and build 3 new ones. I'll buy a plot off of you and build myself a house. That would be nice. I could live in the village." She had immediately seen a way of exploiting my unfortunate situation and tried to use it to her own advantage. I told her that wasn't what I wanted to do. In spite of her obvious disappointment that I wasn't prepared to knock my house down just to suit her needs, she said she would help me and suggested I contact a Mr. John Mitchell, who at the time was the head of planning at Uttlesford District Council. Mr. Mitchell is now the chief executive of that council, but at that time he was the head of planning. I met with Mr. Mitchell and explained my situation to him. He seemed sympathetic and said he would do his best to help me stay in the village and he would point me in the right direction. He suggested visiting my home to see my thatched cottage for himself. So we met on site and straight away he said the cottage could be the answer to my problems. He said, "It's something I can do business with. You've got full permitted development rights, which means you could have half of your garden covered with buildings if you wanted to." He also said something extremely interesting. He said, "We owe you one." He was referring to something very suspicious that had happened some years previously. When we first bought the old school, the land was within what is known as the village development limits, which means that getting planning permission to build on it would be much more favourable than if it were outside the village development limits. However, sometime later, the land was removed from the development limits without me being informed, which was illegal. And this is what Mr. Mitchell was referring to when he said, "We owe you one." I had a further 3 meetings with Mr. Mitchell at his offices, when we both went into great detail regarding what I could and couldn't build. He confirmed that I could extend the cottage as much as I liked, as long as it met with certain regulations. This was wonderful news for me because it meant I could carry on living in the village, close to friends, as well as my doctor and my medical team. So I set about designing a custom-made building that would have no internal doors whatsoever that could cause me any obstruction or that I could bump into. And I sent Mr. Mitchell drawings of what I intended doing, and I kept him fully informed at every stage, and at no time did he tell me that he had any concerns whatsoever. Now, although the main house had a drive-in and a drive-out, the cottage would obviously need its own separate access. So I applied for planning permission to put in a new access. Mr. Peter Trindle, who was the head of White Roding Parish Council, objected, of course, as well as a few other residents in the village. Members of the Uttlesford District Council Planning Committee hired a bus and came down to see where I wanted the new access. As they walked up and down outside my property, they were unaware of my security cameras which were filming and recording them. Some members made extremely insulting and racist remarks about me and the fact that I originally came from Ireland, which I found deeply disturbing and hurtful. But it clearly demonstrated the kind of people I was dealing with and just how prejudiced they were. However, permission was granted for the new access with the condition that one of the other 2 accesses were to be closed. I couldn't understand the logic of this condition, so I met with Mr. Mitchell to discuss it. He said he was also puzzled, but said somebody at the council was obviously very jealous of the fact that we had several cars, including 2 Rolls Royces. But he said there would be no need for me to block one entrance. So once building regulations had been approved, I went ahead and hired a local builder, and work started building my custom design cottage. As soon as the building work started, Mr. Trindle and his parish council started kicking up one hell of a stink, but they were told by Uttlesford Council that I was perfectly entitled to do what I was doing. They were absolutely livid. Just as the building was nearing completion, Mr. Trindle from the parish council wrote to Mr. Mitchell claiming that the work I'd been doing had gone beyond permitted development. So I invited the council's inspector to come and view the work. He came, he looked around and declared I'd done nothing wrong whatsoever, and he later confirmed this to me in writing. Then something quite extraordinary happened. Mr. Mitchell stopped answering my letters. In fact, he ceased all communication with me. I sent a total of 35 emails, letters and faxes, all of which he ignored. Then out of the blue, I got a letter from him. He claimed that the building I just built, at a cost of around £400,000, was illegal, and I had to stop living in it immediately. I was absolutely stunned, and I tried to have a meeting with him, but he refused to see me. He wrote to me denying that he'd ever given me any advice to build my cottage. Now, Mr. Mitchell's cynical denial to me and to his colleagues at Uttlesford District Council inevitably cast doubt on my word, which was obviously his clear intention. He was discrediting me to his colleagues and making me out to be a liar. He wrote and said that if I didn't leave, he would place an enforcement notice on me, forcing me to leave. This was the man who had suggested and encouraged me to build my cottage in the first place, and now he was denying everything and ordering me to get out. But things were about to get a lot worse. Both he and White Roding Parish Council began a campaign of harassment against me and my wife that was to last several years. I had some trees on my property which had tree preservation orders on them. I received a letter from the council claiming that 3 of them had died and needed replacing, and I was told that if I failed to do so, they would enter my property by breaking down the gate, replace the trees and send me the bill. But that wasn't all. They also said I had to close one entrance to my house, and if I didn't do this, they would again break in, remove the gates and block up the gap and send me the bill. I wrote and told them, firstly, that they were wrong regarding replacing the trees, and secondly, that Mr. Mitchell had confirmed to me personally that there was no need to block up one entrance. They wrote back saying Mr. Mitchell had denied he'd ever said such a thing. Throughout all of this, Mr. Trindle and White Roding Parish Council were spying on us day and night. Whenever we went in or out of our property, someone would be hiding behind the telephone box opposite or around the corner. They would walk all the way along the back field to our house, trying to see over the fence. And I lost count of the number of times I caught the secretary from the parish council, Sue Hawkins, peeping through the fence and the gate, trying to see what was going on. She became known in the village as Keyhole Kate. Our rubbish bins were searched every week, and even our front chain link fence was cut open so they could make a hole to get in and take photographs. My postman told me that Mr. Trindle had asked him to spy on us and report back to him. He was absolutely horrified and refused to do such a nasty thing. But that didn't stop my next door neighbour, Catherine Scantlebury, spying on me and making notes as to when my lights were on and off at night, as well as a Mrs. Brown who lived further down the road. She was always spying on us and even wrote to the council with loads of lies about me. When I threatened to sue her, she was forced to apologise to me in writing and withdraw all her spurious allegations. The council also continually harassed me with threatening letters about replacing the trees and blocking up one entrance before they finally agreed, after several years, that one, they were completely wrong regarding the trees, and two, that the matter regarding closing one access would be dropped. But it was too late. All this harassment and being spied on had become a living nightmare, and it was affecting not only my eyesight, but my health generally, and also that of my wife. She eventually had enough and decided to do something I never thought she would want to do: sell the house. No sooner had the house gone on the market than an article appeared in a local newspaper, The Observer, containing lies and false allegations about me. It claimed I was having all sorts of planning problems and I was living in the garage of the house. The clear intention was to try to scupper the sale of the house. It was clear these people would stop at nothing. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not suggesting that everybody who lived in White Roding were harassing us. Most were decent, hard-working people who had no interest whatsoever in my planning problems. No, it was just a handful of people with nothing better to do than interfere and try to ruin somebody else's life. Sometime earlier, Mr. Mitchell had suggested I make a planning application to make the cottage legal. So I did what he suggested. I was confident it would be a success. After all, Mr. Mitchell had said he would do everything he could to support my wish to remain in the village. But he went back on his word and my application was refused. So I appealed. My doctor very kindly attended the hearing in person to give evidence in my support and stated that the cottage was crucial for my future well-being. After hearing all the evidence, the inspector, a lady called Julia Gregory, said that when my electric front gate was open, if anybody happened to be passing by at the time, they'd be able to see my cottage. She said that would be damaging to the openness of the green belt. Therefore, in her opinion, the view through my open gate was far more important than my health and future welfare. Therefore, she refused my appeal. She also stated that the future of the cottage was now in the hands of the council. So I expected the council to arrange a meeting with me to discuss the situation and perhaps reach a compromise. But as usual, Mr. Mitchell had other ideas. Just before Christmas, I received a letter from the council, not to wish me happy Christmas, but to warn me I had 6 months to demolish my cottage. Otherwise, they would arrange for it to be bulldozed and send me the bill. You just couldn't make this up. One couldn't help but wonder if Mr. Mitchell had purposely encouraged me to apply for this planning permission, knowing he would refuse it, knowing that he could then order me to knock it down. The man who encouraged me to build my cottage was now insisting I knock it down. I made one final attempt to save my cottage from being bulldozed. I made a final appeal. Before the hearing, I had a meeting with Mr. Mitchell, and he indicated that if I was to sell my cottage back to whoever bought the house and it became part of my new neighbour's land, then the council would not fight to have it demolished. He said it would be pointless for the council asking for the cottage to be demolished when my neighbour could quite legally rebuild it again. His exact words were, "We would be wasting a lot of people's time making people take it down and then put it up again." I told Mr. Mitchell that I had in fact been in discussion with somebody who was interested in buying the house, and that they were also interested in purchasing my cottage as well. And I asked him not to issue any enforcement notice, as this could easily put this person off buying the cottage and scupper negotiations to sell the house. He promised to hold fire and not issue any notice. He said, "I'll tell the legal people to hang fire, especially if it's somebody's house. If it wasn't a house, if it was just buildings or something, we would be clashing around like nobody's business. But because you, as a person, as an individual human being, we will be as light-footed as possible, if you like." So I left this meeting with two promises from Mr. Mitchell. One, that he would not be seeking the demolition of my cottage if the new owner of the house bought it, and two, that he would not issue an enforcement notice until the deal had gone through. Did he keep his promise? Did he hell? 3 days later, he issued an enforcement notice. Now, although I was well used to him breaking his word, I was still pretty stunned by his latest betrayal. My solicitor wrote asking why he'd gone back on his word. He wrote back denying he had ever made any promise or given any such assurance. He said, "This is not correct. I gave no such assurances, and my contemporaneous note reflects this." Once again, Mr. Mitchell was casting doubt on my word. I wrote and asked him to explain himself. He never answered. In spite of their efforts, the inspector decided that the cottage would not be demolished. The cottage could stay, but I couldn't live in it. I had 6 months to get out. Crazy, I know, but that was his decision. One interesting thing that emerged at the appeal was when the council's representative, a Mr. Clive Theobald, was asked during cross-examination under oath if the advice that Mr. Mitchell had given me was correct. Mr. Theobald admitted it was wrong. That is now on record. So there you have it. Mr. Mitchell gave me wrong advice. And rather than do the decent thing and hold his hands up and say, "Oh, sorry, I made a mistake," and try and work out a solution, he decided instead to deny he had ever given me any advice, denied ever having said anything to me about any of the issues I've been telling you about. Total denial. And in the process made me out to be the one in the wrong. Fortunately, the sale of the house went through, but I was left with no alternative but to sell my lovely cottage to the new owners of the house. I suffered huge financial loss, not to mention personal loss as well. But there's something far, far more disgusting. Through the Freedom of Information Act and the Data Protection Act, and after a very, very long battle, I managed to obtain copies of emails from the council which tell a dreadful tale. I found out that Councillor Barker, the very first person I went to for help at the very beginning, was the one behind all the harassment that me and my wife had endured all those years. Not only that, but Councillor Barker was the reason all my planning applications were refused. Email after email shows she was in constant touch with Mr. Mitchell, White Roding Parish Council, as well as other councillors such as Councillor Cheetham, Councillor Elizabeth Godwin, discussing me and my affairs and plotting ways to destroy any chance of me staying in the village. She lobbied to have my planning application refused, and amongst those that she lobbied was a Mr. Mike Ovenden, the council's head of development control at the time. In July 2008, Mr. Ovenden emailed Councillor Barker and stated, "I refer to our telephone conversation today. I presume you would be happy that the application," that's my application, "remains delegated if it was to be recommended for refusal. This would provide a strong degree of certainty for you that the application would be refused." In another email, she is discussing with the parish council about going to press about me. She was involved with the local Observer newspaper and fed them lies about me. She never had any intentions of helping me. There is no doubt in my mind whatsoever that had I agreed to knock my house down and create 3 building plots, as she suggested on my first meeting with her, and I kept one for myself and sold her one so she could build her own house and live in the village, that application would have been passed by the council, no problem. But because I turned her suggestion down, she made sure she put a spanner in the works for me at every opportunity to make sure I failed in my attempt to stay in the village. She said she would help me to my face, just like Mr. Mitchell said he would. But all the time she was working behind my back, doing everything in her power to ruin me. Councillor Susan Barker was my Judas, and Mr. Mitchell was only too pleased to help her because he realised he had given me wrong advice and wanted to cover his tracks. But the most revealing and certainly the most shocking email was one from Sue Hawkins, the clerk of White Roding Parish Council, to Susan Barker, my Judas. It reveals exactly why my wife and I were spied on for all that time. It was because Uttlesford District Council asked White Roding Parish Council to spy on us. On September the 1st, 2008, Sue Hawkins, the clerk of White Roding Parish Council, wrote to all the members of the council with a news flash, telling them that she had received a phone call from the new enforcement officer at Uttlesford District Council. It seems this new enforcement officer needed their help to gather evidence against me. She goes on to list the ways that the enforcement officer had suggested this evidence could be gathered, such as asking the milkman, paper delivery man and the postman to spy on me and supply information back to them, as well as watching and noting down when my lights came on and off in the evening at the cottage, and making notes of every time I entered or left through my front gate. But she didn't just write to the members of the White Roding Parish Council, she also wrote on the very same date to Councillor Susan Barker, telling her exactly the same thing. But she also said to her, "Do you have any idea what else we might do? Frustration is high!" Exclamation mark. They were desperate for evidence to help Mr. Mitchell prove I was living in my cottage after he told me to vacate it, and they were willing to go to any lengths to do so. This is treachery beyond belief. I've written to Mr. Mitchell, Councillor Barker, Councillor Cheetham, White Roding Parish Council, asking for an explanation for their appalling behaviour. Not a single one ever replied. But just when you think things couldn't get worse, they do. As part of the appeal process, I supplied Mr. Mitchell with a copy of my medical history. Now, this file formed part of my evidence to substantiate my medical problems. I gave the file to them on condition that it was for their eyes only, and asked for it to be returned to me as soon as the appeal had been heard. However, I heard through the grapevine that my file had been made available at the council offices for the general public to see. I couldn't believe that they would be so callous, so cruel, so nasty. So I decided to investigate. My wife drove me to the council offices in Saffron Walden, where I asked to see my file. And sure enough, when I opened it, there on the very top were my complete medical records. Written in bold lettering on top of my file were the words, "Confidential, not for public inspection." I was, understandably, very, very angry. So I removed my medical records and went back to our car in the council's car park. My mobile rang and it was a bad reception, so we moved a short distance from the car to get a better reception. When we returned to the car, we found the car keys were missing. And a few moments later, a Mr. Theobald appeared. Now, he was the officer who had been dealing all along with my case and had tried unsuccessfully, on Mr. Mitchell's instructions, to get my cottage demolished. He had a huge smirk on his face and he was dangling our car keys in front of our faces. When we asked for them back, he refused. He claimed we had stolen something from our file, and unless we gave it back, he would keep our keys. He was visibly shaking. I calmly explained that I had in fact removed my personal medical records, my own personal property, which the council were supposed to have returned to me, and instead they put them in a file so that anybody from the general public could view them. I told them that this was disgraceful and unforgivable. It took some considerable time to get this across to Mr. Theobald, but eventually he calmed down and realised his mistake and reluctantly handed back our car keys, but with no apology. But his behaviour had demonstrated how power has gone to the heads of Uttlesford District Council members. I made a formal complaint about Mr. Theobald. My complaint wasn't heard by somebody independent. It was heard by none other than, guess who? Mr. Mitchell. He wrote back saying he saw nothing wrong whatsoever in Mr. Theobald's behaviour. But then he would, wouldn't he? A few years ago, a couple from Poole in Dorset were secretly spied on by their local council, who became suspicious they didn't live in a particular school catchment area. However, they won a landmark legal ruling when a tribunal ruled that Poole Borough Council had unlawfully used its powers to spy on the couple for 3 weeks, and their surveillance breached the family's human rights. Corina Ferguson, who is the legal officer for Liberty, said, "Intrusive surveillance is vital to fighting terrorism and serious crime. But the abuse of power by Poole Borough Council brought it into disrepute." This couple had endured 3 weeks of surveillance. My wife and I endured 4 years of surveillance, not to mention serious harassment. And something else, in all the time I was unwell, not one single person from the village of White Roding knocked on my door to ask how I was or if I needed anything. So much for so-called Christians who go to church and sing hymns about love thy neighbour. Now, believe it or not, Mr. Peter Trindle, the chairman of White Roding Parish Council, continues to spy on the cottage years after I vacated it. He's still convinced I'm living there. He's been seen on many occasions sitting in his car outside, waiting to see if I go in or out. He's been caught on security cameras spying over the fence from next door, and he even went so far as to organise a raid one day with an enforcement officer from Uttlesford District Council called Sonia Williams. They both illegally entered the property and ran around the cottage taking photographs through the windows and terrified the new owners. There's something very rotten at the core of Uttlesford District Council. Councillor Susan Barker is still a councillor with Uttlesford, as well as with Essex County Council, where she's chairman of the Audit Committee, no less. Her colleague, Lord Hanningfield, the former leader of the council, remember him? He went to jail for fiddling his expenses, and while he was in jail, he was still claiming his £11,500 expenses. A criminal investigation by the police into £288,000 he claimed on council credit cards was dropped, but he served 9 months in prison for fiddling his expenses in the House of Lords, from which he was suspended for 1 year, after further abuses of the expenses system, including money he said was for the care of his dog. Essex County Council claim he still owes them £50,000, but Councillor Susan Barker recommended that no action be taken whatsoever to recover this money. She said it would take too much time and be far too expensive to pursue Lord Hanningfield for the £50,000 she claims he owes. But she had plenty of time and an endless supply of taxpayers' money to pursue me relentlessly for several years. And since Mr. Mitchell became Chief Executive of Uttlesford District Council, we, the taxpayer, have paid him getting on for £1 million in salary. Mr. Mitchell has denied over and over again that he ever advised me or said certain things to me. He denied it not only in writing to me and to my solicitor, but to all his colleagues at the council. As I said already, his clear intention was to discredit me. But if there's one thing that I've learned during my time on this planet, and it's never to trust the kind of people I've been telling you about. So every single meeting I had with Mr. John Mitchell, I recorded. I've got the proof who's really telling the truth.